Upon arriving at the palace, PrinceDubem was struck with shock. His manhood had vanished. Overcome with terror, he let out a piercing scream. Determined to find a solution, he resolved to visit the river the next morning, hoping to plead with the mermaid for its return. However, when he reached the riverbank, she was nowhere to be found. Long ago, in the land of Odi, there lived a proud and arrogant prince named Dubem. Feared throughout the kingdom, he carried himself with an air of superiority. As the only son of the king, Dubem was next in line for the throne. His father lay gravely ill, and rather than mourning his condition, the prince eagerly awaited his passing, eager to claim the crown. With power and influence on his side, Dubem ruled over the people with intimidation. Many dreaded the day he would become king. Worse still, he used his status to take advantage of young women in the village, his victims too fearful to speak his name or reveal the truth of what had been done to them. There, he forced himself on her, warning that she must never utter a word about what had happened. Terrified of the consequences, Onyeka remained silent, returning home as if nothing had occurred. Weeks passed before she realized she was pregnant. Confused and unsure of what to do, she kept the truth to herself. One morning, her aging mother found her vomiting and immediately demanded to know who was responsible for the pregnancy. Yet, Onyeka remained silent, aware of the shame and turmoil such a revelation would bring upon her family and herself. As the months went by, her condition became undeniable. With her growing belly now visible, she became the subject of whispers and ridicule. The villagers speculated endlessly about the identity of the father, making Onyeka feel trapped in a nightmare. She could hardly believe how drastically her life had changed in an instant. Her mother no longer spoke to her, refusing to acknowledge her after she refused to reveal the identity of the man responsible for her pregnancy. Meanwhile, PrinceDubem showed no signs of stopping his vile actions. He continued preying on young maidens in the village who lived in fear of his cruelty. His wickedness reached new depths when he assaulted a young maiden named Chinwe, who was set to be married the very next day. Desperate, she pleaded with the prince, explaining that she had to remain a virgin for her husband. Her family had proudly informed her fiancé of her purity, making it all the more important to her. Yet, Dubem ignored her cries and forced himself upon her, stealing what she had preserved for her future husband. Devastated and unable to face her family, Chinwe made a heartbreaking decision. She drowned herself in the village river, leaving the entire community in shock and mourning. The villagers could not understand what had driven her to such despair. On the eve of her wedding, when news of Chinwe's tragic death reached the prince, he felt no remorse. The suffering of his victims meant nothing to him, and he remained unmoved by the pain he had caused. One evening, as PrinceDubem wandered toward the village stream, his eyes fell upon a stunning young maiden fetching water alone. Realizing there were no witnesses, he seized the opportunity and forced himself upon her, showing once again the depths of his cruelty. Once he had finished, the prince noticed something unsettling. The maiden had not struggled or screamed. Instead, she remained, eerily still, watching him. A sudden transformation took place before his eyes, and she revealed her true form, a fierce-looking mermaid. A wave of terror consumed PrinceDubem. His heart pounded wildly as he turned and fled, running faster than he ever had before. Upon reaching the palace, an even greater horror awaited him. He discovered that his manhood had vanished. Overcome with shock, he let out a terrified scream. Desperate for a solution, the prince resolved to visit the river the next morning, hoping to beg the mermaid to restore what she had taken. However, when he arrived, she was nowhere to be found. He waited by the stream for hours, but there was no sign of her. Defeated, he returned to the palace, struggling to come to terms with the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, his father's health continued to deteriorate, and panic set in. The looming reality of his father's death meant that he would soon ascend the throne, and tradition dictated that he must take a wife who would bear him an heir. With no way to fulfill this duty, fear gripped him. He could not imagine the humiliation that would follow when people discovered the truth about his condition. Determined to find a solution, he decided to return to the river once more. This time, he carried offerings, hoping to appease the mermaid. As he waited, she finally emerged from the water, her belly swollen with pregnancy. PrinceDubem stood frozen in disbelief, his eyes widening as tears streamed down his face. The mermaid spoke, breaking the silence, and revealed a shocking truth. She was carrying his child. She declared that he was now bound to her and forbidden from taking another wife, warning that any attempt to do so would lead to his downfall. With a solemn expression, she proclaimed that, by virtue of her pregnancy, she was now his rightful wife, and he should prepare for the birth of their child, which was fast approaching. As soon as she finished speaking, she vanished beneath the water, leaving PrinceDubem paralyzed in shock. He could hardly grasp the reality that he was now wed to a mermaid. Lost in thought, he made his way back to the palace, only to be interrupted by a palace guard who informed him that the king had requested his presence. Upon arriving before his father, the king wasted no time in delivering his message. He announced that the time had come for Dubem to ascend the throne and that a maiden had already been chosen to be his bride. The king instructed him to prepare for their meeting the following evening. Conflicted, PrinceDubem hesitantly asked what would happen if he decided to marry someone else instead. His father's response was firm. Defying tradition would cost him the throne. The gods had decreed that only by marrying the chosen bride could he rightfully inherit the seat of his forefathers. For a fleeting moment, Dubem considered presenting the mermaid as his bride to secure his position as king. But just as quickly as the thought came, he realized the impossibility of such a plan, watching his hopes crumble before his eyes. Sensing the tension in the air, the king turned to his son and asked what was troubling him. Overwhelmed with guilt, PrinceDubem could no longer contain his emotions. He fell to his knees and, with tears in his eyes, begged his father for forgiveness. In a moment of raw honesty, he confessed to his sins. He admitted to being a rapist, detailing how he had forced himself upon several women in the village. He then revealed the shocking truth, that one of his victims was a mermaid, now carrying his child and holding his manhood hostage. He recounted her warning that taking another wife would lead to his downfall. With a heavy heart, he told his father that he could not marry the bride chosen by the gods, for doing so would seal his fate. The king listened in silence, his face etched with deep disappointment. After a long pause, he spoke. There is no deed without consequence. The throne is not merely a seat of power, it is a pedestal of virtue. He then turned to his son and asked, "How can a man who has stained his hands with such wickedness expect to rule over the very people he has caused so much pain?" At those words, PrinceDubem broke down completely. Sobbing, he admitted that he was unworthy of the throne. The king, unwavering in his judgment, told him that he would have to face the consequences of his actions. If he ever wished to find peace, he must seek forgiveness from every woman he had wronged, including the mermaid carrying his child. However, PrinceDubem soon realized the challenge before him. He could not even recall all the women he had wronged. Upon hearing this, the king told his son that there was only one solution. He must confess his sins before the entire village and seek their forgiveness. Only then would he be allowed to remain in the kingdom. But there was a grave consequence. By making this confession, he would forfeit his right to the throne, and leadership would pass to another. Though deeply saddened by this reality, PrinceDubem accepted his fate. He stood before the villagers, who gathered in stunned silence, eager to hear what their prince had to say. Taking a deep breath, he spoke. "I stand before you not as your prince, but as a man shackled by his own grave misjudgments, his voice barely rising above the murmurs of the crowd. I have wronged many, and my actions have cast shadows upon our land. To the women I have harmed, to the spirits I have offended, and to the mermaid who now bears my child, I offer my deepest apologies. As his words echoed through the village, the sky above darkened ominously. The river waters began to stir, rippling with an eerie force. From its depths, the mermaid emerged, cradling a child in her arms. As she stepped forward, making her way toward the palace, a hush fell over the crowd. The sight of her sent shivers through the villagers, silencing even the faintest whispers. PrinceDubem's eyes locked onto the baby in her arms. Overwhelmed, he fell to his knees before the mermaid as the weight of his past came crashing down upon him. Uncertain of what was to come, PrinceDubem knelt before the mermaid, waiting for her judgment. She gazed at him and finally spoke. Their child, she revealed, was born of both land and water and would serve as a bridge between the two worlds. She told Dubem that he would remain on Earth to raise their son, always remembering that he was bound to her in marriage. With a stern expression, she issued a final warning. He was never to take another wife. This was his punishment for the countless wrongs he had committed. Then, without another word, she placed their child in his arms and, as a final act, restored his manhood before disappearing beneath the waters once more. Meanwhile, news of all that had transpired reached the king on his sickbed. With a heavy heart, he summoned his personal guard and ordered an announcement to be made to the people. The throne would soon pass to another, for his son was unworthy of ruling the land. The declaration sent ripples through the kingdom. In the days that followed, it was announced that a new king would soon ascend the throne. This news filled the heart of the king's only brother, Mazi Okeke, with overwhelming joy. As the next in line, he could hardly believe his time had finally come. However, his excitement quickly turned into an insatiable hunger for power. Drunk on the thought of ruling, Mazi Okeke began to impose his will upon the people. He demanded that villagers bow their heads in his presence and treated them as mere subjects beneath his feet. His arrogance soon escalated into outright tyranny. He warned the people that the rule of PrinceDubem was nothing compared to what awaited them under his reign. His thirst for power blinded him to the virtues of leadership, and before long his actions became a reflection of Dubem's darkest days. The people of Odi, having just witnessed the fall of one tyrant, now feared they were on the brink of another. Yet what they did not realize was that the gods were watching. The gods sent a message to the king through the village's chief priest, declaring that neither Dubem nor Okeke was fit to rule. Instead, the rightful heir was a child born to a maiden in the village, Onyeka, the woman Dubem had violated years ago. The child's name was Uzoma. The gods revealed how Onyeka had struggled alone, raising him in secret, fearful of the consequences, if the truth of his lineage ever emerged. They warned the ailing king that Uzoma must be crowned immediately to prevent his uncle, Okeke, from taking his life. Understanding the gravity of the situation and knowing his brother's ruthless nature, the king sought out Uzoma in secret. In a solemn ceremony before the chief priest and the gods of the land, he crowned the boy as the rightful king. Onyeka was overwhelmed with emotion. After years of pain and disgrace, fate had finally smiled upon her. She was now the mother of a king. By the time Okeke learned of what had happened, Uzoma had already been crowned. Enraged, he saw his dreams of power shatter before his eyes. Driven by fury and a thirst for revenge, he plotted to kill the young king and seize the throne for himself. However, his plans were thwarted by Onyeka, who remained ever watchful, standing as her son's protector. Recognizing Okeke's treachery, the young king banished him from the palace, warning him never to return. With that, Uzoma's reign began, guided by the wisdom of the gods and the love of his mother and grandfather. He grew into a just and compassionate leader, uniting the land and ushering in an era of peace and prosperity for Odi. As for Prince Dubem, he sought out Onyeka and their son, offering heartfelt apologies for all the pain he had caused them. Though forgiven, he chose to live in quiet seclusion, far from the palace, dedicating his days to raising the son he had with the mermaid. That child, named Ez, was indeed a bridge between two worlds. He possessed a deep connection with nature, communicating effortlessly with animals and sea creatures alike. His mother, the mermaid, visited at intervals, ensuring that their bond remained unbroken. Bound by fate, Dubem remained married to her for life, unable to take another wife. Moral of the story: our actions always have consequences. Power should never be used to oppress others, for no evil deed goes unpunished. True leadership is not about domination, but about service. A leader should uplift, protect, and guide, not instill fear and suffering. No matter how high one rises, humility remains the greatest virtue of all. I hope you enjoyed the story.